Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Wednesday, September 16th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined today in our virtual studio by Molly Gray, who is the Democratic Party's nominee for the Lieutenant Governor position. She won that right by winning the primary on August 11th. And Ms. Gray, it is great to have you with us today. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to GNAT-TV. It's wonderful to be here virtually today.
Well, great to have you with us. For those of you who haven't met Ms. Gray yet, she's a lifelong Vermonter who hails from Newbury, Vermont, which is up on the eastern side of the state. She's a graduate of the University of Vermont and the Vermont Law School. She's been a congressional aide to Congressman Peter Welch, and has also worked in government relations with the International Committee of the Red Cross. She teaches night courses at the Vermont Law School and most recently has served as the Assistant Attorney General in the Criminal Division of the Vermont Attorney General's Office, currently on leave from that position during the campaign. Again, Ms. Gray, thank you so much for making the time to be with us to share your views on some of the major issues facing the state. As I understand, this is your first try for publicly elected office. What prompted you to throw your hat in the ring at this point in time?
It's true, I haven't run for elected office before, but as I travel around Vermont, and especially in the weeks and the months leading up to deciding to run, it was pretty clear to me that Vermont's at a crossroads. We've struggled to keep a generation here. We've struggled to draw a generation back to the state, and we've struggled to draw a generation that's not yet here, to Vermont. We know that we have more deaths than births in a majority of Vermont counties. I think Chittenden County and maybe Grand Isle County, parts of it, or Franklin County are an exception. We're soon to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest states in the country. Our tax base is shrinking. And the list goes on in terms of the crisis that is our demographic challenges. And then throwing on top of that, obviously what we're experiencing with this pandemic. But for me, as someone who was born and raised here, who went to our school system, a proud product of Newbury Elementary School and Oxbow High School and Stratton Mountain School there in Bennington or Windham County, the University of Vermont and Vermont Law School, as someone who's worked across the world, also in Washington and across our state, and came home to be part of our communities and to be part of a state that I love. I think the Lieutenant Governor's office and myself as someone with really diverse experiences and background, I think it's a unique place and a unique time to focus on our demographic challenges, focus on the future of Vermont, focus on making Vermont the place that's viable, inclusive, welcoming, sustainable, and resilient for the future. And frankly, our future depends on it. So that's why I'm running, and I look forward to bringing my diversity of experience to the office at a time when I think we need some new, bold leadership for our future.
Just to kind of follow up on your work career there at the Attorney General's office, on your website, you call for demilitarizing the police and investing in safety, de-escalation, and community services. I was wondering if you could walk us through what you mean specifically there, and what your vision might be for law enforcement, which obviously is a major issue across the country, really, at this point in time.
Yeah, we're in so many moments, right? And I talked about our demographic challenges, but if we think about what we are experiencing, a global pandemic, the first in my lifetime, I think the last pandemic we experienced was a century ago. Massive and justifiable social unrest across the US, but also here in Vermont, an economic crisis, climate change. But if we're going to be a Vermont that's safe, that's resilient, that's inclusive, that starts with our communities. That starts with ensuring that individuals who move to our state feel safe, feel welcome. What we've seen in Vermont in, I think, recent years, I work in the Attorney General's office in the criminal division, what we continue to see is more suicides by cop, effectively officer-involved shootings. That's scary. That's incredibly scary for our law enforcement. We've asked them to be mental health professionals. We've asked them to suit up in gear that we see generally in conflict zones, to carry AR-15s. We see up armored vehicles in some of our communities. Basically, the weaponry that we would see in conflict here in Vermont, that doesn't create a strong and safe and comfortable feeling with our communities. So in my view, and I think in the view of so many Vermonters today, we need to rethink, redesign our police so that they are advocates for our communities. They have strong relationships with our communities that are based on trust, based on true feelings of service, that are integrated into our communities. And that's what that's what I mean when I talk about demilitarizing the police. I also talk about de-escalation. And one thing that we know is that when we see mental health providers and support service providers addressing mental health crisis rather than police, there's a different outcome. And so one thing that I'm committed to and excited to work on is working with our Attorney General, working with our legislature, working with our communities to work for real criminal justice reform so that we see changes in our use of force standards, we see more support for de-escalation, and then separately, we draw a clear line between what is the role of our police, and I talked about that, right, being real advocates for our communities, building trust, versus what is the role of our mental health and support service professionals, and making sure that our budget is adequately funded, and we separate those two. I think that's what oftentimes, what we're talking about when we talk about defund the police, but what it really is a reallocation, a transformation of our resources so that we're focused on prevention rather than addressing crisis is what we see regularly in our communities. So that's part of my vision for the future of Vermont in the Lieutenant Governor's office.
One of the other things I noticed on your website was that your call for investing more in childcare and education. And I'm sure just about everybody's in favor of that. How much money do you anticipate that would cost, and where would that money come from? Is it would we reallocate money from somewhere else in the state budget to that, or how would that work?
Yeah, I think this is a moment where we have to align our budget with our greatest needs. I'm not going to give you an exact figure because frankly, I'd want to work with the legislature to figure out what is the exact amount of money that we need now for education. We do actually have one of the most well-funded K through 12 education systems in the country. I don't think we necessarily need to provide additional funding, but think about how we're spending that money. What we know right now when it comes to our schools reopening, there are a lot of schools that don't have adequate ventilation systems. Some schools have had to close right now just because we haven't invested in an adequate infrastructure. So I think it's looking at how that money is being spent and the investments that we need to make within our K through 12 system. Separately, when we think about higher ed, we haven't adequately funded our state colleges, VTC, Northern Vermont University, which I know as Lyndon and Johnson from growing up. But what we know is that we have the highest graduation rate in the country. That's incredible from our high schools, from our K through 12 system. Yet 41% of our graduates don't go on to any additional training. And then when we speak to our employers around the state, we hear that we have massive recruitment challenges, we have massive retention challenges, and employers, this is not only our businesses, but pick a sector, nursing, education, plumbers, electricians, even lawyers. And my parents will be the first to say we don't need more lawyers. But the truth is we have a gap in our classroom to community pipeline that's impacting the ability of our students to access good paying jobs and our employers to recruit and retain skilled, well-trained, certified labor. So when I talk about investing in education, that's what I'm talking about. And frankly, it's the best economic investment we can make as we again, try to draw people to Vermont, or people come here to go to school, keep them here because we know we have access to opportunity. On the other end, you talked about childcare. And childcare before COVID-19 was something that a lot of families were struggling to access. If we think about all the ways that our working parents are breaking up the paycheck, childcare oftentimes can be half a salary. It's extremely expensive in Vermont. So then we find our parents in a position of having to choose between staying in their job or having two parents in the workforce to afford childcare, or not staying in their job. And that impacts our economy. And then we throw this pandemic on top of that, which is in many ways, it's like the tide going out, right? We see everything. Everything is laid bare, including access to childcare. In this hybrid model of learning where we see students in the classroom maybe for 2 days and then 3 days at home, our parents are struggling. And the best thing we can do in this moment is say, let's align our budget with our greatest needs and make some strategic economic investments that are also going to make us more resilient, put our communities and families first, invest in higher education, invest in workforce development on the one end, and on the other end, invest in childcare. And I know that with that alignment of the budget, we can do it in a way that doesn't create additional tax burden for Vermont, and we can also consider new revenue sources. So I'm confident we can do it with the right focus. Certainly, as working as Lieutenant Governor, I'm committed to working on those issues and bringing our legislators and governor and communities together to get it done.
You mentioned the state colleges in the course of your answer there. I guess I find myself wondering, was former Chancellor Jeb Spaulding right when maybe one or two of those campuses just needs to close because they just aren't financially viable any longer?
I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, if we're going to continue funding our state colleges, which I believe we should do, how are we going to do that in a way that makes them sustainable and viable? Also, how are we going to do it in a way that supports our economy, supports, as I said, all of our businesses that are looking for trained workers? In some cases, it may be 2-year degrees. Some cases, it may be 4-year degrees. In some cases, we may be able to provide different certifications to help those who are in the workforce seek additional training. I think, and this is one of the first things I called for as Lieutenant Governor, when the question around budgeting and funding for our state colleges came to a head in March, was the creation of a statewide task force with a clear mandate and a clear time for a concrete and an actionable plan for our state colleges, and put on that task force folks who are hiring from our state colleges. Green Mountain Power, for example, some of our solar industry, renewable energy sector businesses, for example, nurses, head educators in the state, and try to figure out what is a viable plan, what does that look like, and then how do we right size? And there will be right sizing. That's just the reality. I also want to speak briefly about CCV, Community Colleges of Vermont. We have, in fact, I think some of the most expensive CCV in the country. 80% of CCV's operating budget comes from tuition, comes from Vermonters in our communities paying a lot of money to access community college. One thing that we could do as part of this right sizing and part of our investment and economic strategy is to flip that structure so that actually the tuition costs are the 20% and the state's paying for the 80%. And it's a way for us to say, we value that additional training, we're going to make it possible, and then we're not going to have our graduates and students come out of school with a mountain of debt that then forces them to think about leaving the state or going to a better market. We can do it. This is the best economic plan for the state, one of them. But as I said, and as you alluded to, we have to rethink the model and make some adjustments so that it's sustainable for the future.
Yesterday, the governor vetoed the Global Warming Solution Act that the legislature had passed. I'm gathering from your website that you're a supporter of the Global Warming Solutions Act. What makes that act a good idea?
In a nutshell, let's think about our response to the pandemic. We have trusted the scientists. We have put a plan in place here in Vermont. We've worn our masks, we respect social distancing guidelines, and we're seeing Vermonters and Vermont as a place that is safe, largely, that is healthy, that has probably led the nation. But when it comes to climate change, and what we know here in Vermont is that we have an increase in tick-borne illness. We hear that from our community health professionals. We have maple sugar makers who've been boiling sap in January, which is largely unheard of. We have one of the driest summers, half the amount of normal rainfall that we normally receive. We see a ski industry that's trying to make snow because we don't have normal snowfall. We see the impact scientifically and actually within our own state and our communities every day. The Global Warming Solutions Act takes the Paris Climate Accord, which is something that our governor supports, a lot of states around the country support. The US did support, but has subsequently under this administration pulled back on its support. It takes that effort and brings it to the local level and basically says, Vermonters, we hear you. We know our businesses are struggling. We know our communities are struggling. We know our families are struggling. There are pieces of our economy that are deeply affected by climate change. We're going to commit to carbon emission reductions over a certain period of time. We're going to put together a council and task force with experts who know how to do that in the state, who are going to make recommendations, and then we're going to hold ourselves accountable. It's not a perfect plan. It's not a perfect solution, but the time for waiting is over. We know that because we're seeing it. And so this is the first step in showing that Vermont can lead, showing that we have a plan to take care of our Vermonters, and then implementing it. So I do support it. I trust that the legislature, with an extremely strong majority and an incredible amount of support in both chambers for the bill, will override the governor's veto, and we'll get to work on taking true steps to mitigate the impact of climate change on our communities and taking care of our families here in Vermont.
One question I had about it was, as I understand it, it would give Vermonters the right to sue the state government if certain emission targets weren't met. And some of those targets sound pretty ambitious. How would we go about achieving those kinds of emissions reductions in what's a relatively short period of time?
I trust that the legislature has received adequate testimony. I know the Attorney General and lawyers in the Attorney General's Environmental Division have weighed in on the cause of action, the constitutionality. This wasn't a bill that was put together overnight. This was a lot of thoughtful work and expertise coming together. Moreover, this is what Vermonters have called for. There have been meetings across the state and communities, and I think this is a reflection of Vermonters saying, we are ready to lead, we're ready to take steps. We know that climate action isn't going to happen on its own, right? Reductions won't happen on their own. We have to act. We have to act now. And I'll just say this. I woke up this morning and I went outside after listening to VPR. And I think it was the weather forecaster saying that it would be a little bit cloudy and hazy today. And because of the wildfires on the West Coast, and we are in Vermont, so we can do a lot here in the state, but I think we also have to acknowledge that there's so much happening nationally. We have to act. We have to act to protect our communities, to protect our businesses, to protect our economy. We don't have a choice anymore. And so while this may not be perfect, it is a good starting point. It is a good plan. And I know that as Vermonters, in the same way we have with this pandemic, we can come together and we can take action that's going to set us up for a safer future, a better future, a healthier future, and put us on the right path.
Of great interest down here, and I'm sure elsewhere, and indeed probably up your neck of the woods in Vermont too, is the broadband question. A lot of parts of Vermont aren't getting modern levels of broadband quality that we need, and of course the pandemic has revealed that to be an even bigger problem for education, telemedicine, remote working, all these things. Would it be a priority for you to kind of keep the pressure on, so to speak, to see that better broadband is available and more widely across the state? And how what's your preferred route to getting there?
Absolutely, Andrew. I think broadband, frankly, is one of the best investments we can make. And I've talked about childcare. I think broadband is first or second. It's right there, top among our economic opportunities. And here's why. A fourth of Vermont today geographically still can't get online. Something like 70,000 homes and residents. In this moment where we're trying to attract people to Vermont, and not just to Chittenden County, but to Bennington County or to Orange County, where I grew up. Frankly, if you're going to buy a home, the first thing you want to know, we hear this from our realtors, is there internet access, right? So that's one, right? If we're going to expand our tax base and draw generation back, we have to address it for that reason. But then I want to talk about all of us in our communities right now. There are teachers who are trying to access students who can't get online. There are parents who are trying to provide online learning who can't get online. 1 in 3 children in Newberry, where I grew up, can't get online. This impedes access to telemedicine. Gone are the days, or gone should be the days, of having to get in the car and drive 2 hours, in some cases, for a basic health checkup. That's something we should be able to do, and some people are able to do over the internet. In this pandemic, a lot of our basic support services, access to unemployment benefits, access to basic health and safety information around this pandemic, have all been moved online, but then it's only accessible to some Vermonters. So I won't belabor the point, but I think it's time to think of the internet as a utility, no different than water or heat in our homes, and we would be outraged in 2020 if 70,000 homes and businesses didn't have access to heat. So let's get a little outraged. I think we should all be about not having access to the internet. And then the other question is, how do we do it? A lot of governors and lieutenant governors have talked about this, and I don't want to claim to have the answer, but I think we're very close now to knowing how to do it. I think it's in conjunction with and partnership with our federal delegation seeking federal funding. I know Congressman Welsh is pushing for this and understands that rural internetification, not electrification, which is what we're facing, right? How do we do it? That we need the money to be able to do it here in Vermont. That we can do it in conjunction with our communications union districts, EC Fiber, as you know, one of them, but they're popping up around Vermont and they're able to deploy fiber. And then finally, it's sitting down with our providers in the state and saying, if you want to do business in Vermont, we need you to be committed to helping us figure this out. And that's going to be a prerequisite to our future and to operating here. So it will take time. It's going to be hard. It won't happen overnight, but it's time to come together, to work together, to commit to a plan, to work with our federal delegation to get the funding and to get it done. Because at this point, access to internet is the highway to access to basic services for Vermonters. And as I said, it's one of the best economic investments we can make.
We have time for like one last question, and I just wanted to ask this one because it's kind of a big issue down here in our part of the state, and I'm sure it is elsewhere, and that's the one of affordable or workforce housing. Right now in Manchester, most people who work in Manchester can't afford to live in Manchester. They commute in from other neighboring towns, often fairly substantial distances. And I just find myself wondering, why is it when the marketplace is screaming at the loudest possible volume that more workforce or affordable housing needs to be constructed, why so many developers seem to be unable to kind of pencil it out, as the expression goes, to make it something that they deem to be a worthwhile use of their time and revenue? Is there a role for the state to play in making more affordable housing available?
Yes, I don't think the state should do it alone. I think if we look at our housing needs across Vermont, you mentioned Manchester. I know in Bennington, there's the Putnam Block project that's been incredibly successful. There's been similar projects in Brattleboro or in Barrie City. But if we look to our rural areas like Newberry in Orange County or parts of the Northeast Kingdom, it's not that there isn't enough housing. Frankly, the housing isn't safe. It's not weatherized. It's not accessible. In Chittenden County and Burlington, there isn't enough housing. There isn't even close enough housing. And then the cost of housing continues to skyrocket. So I think, one, there's room for a statewide needs assessment to identify the diversity of housing needs across Vermont. Second, it's working with our cities, towns, and municipalities to understand what resources are available to ensure that there's access to affordable housing. Then there's some other pieces. We didn't talk about Act 250 yet during this call, but let's face it, it's an antiquated law. It hasn't been redrafted or rewritten in 50 years. Our development needs are different. And that's not to say that we want to do away with it by any means. We absolutely need Act 250. It's just to think about how to reframe it to touch upon the challenges that exist today, right? And then finally, I think we also have to address, can our workers and families, mostly our workers, can they live where they work? And why is that? Is it simply about housing, or is it also about other costs of living or salary? I mean, we talk a lot about the minimum wage here in Vermont. And I often think about how many ways we chop up the paycheck every month, right? We talk about raising the minimum wage. Even if it's $15, is that enough for families that are paying for prescription drugs, for healthcare in some cases, for childcare? In my case, I'm still paying my student loan. Loan debt, and also trying to pay my rent. I can't afford a home, and I'm 36 and I have a good job. So I think it's also addressing the constellation of expenses that Vermonters have, that we have, and it's a lot. And housing is a piece of the puzzle, but I think we have to address, as I said, childcare, internet access, and some of the other things that we can do as a state to just take some of the burden off and create economic opportunity at the same time. And that's what I'm committed to as Lieutenant Governor, using this office to truly address our demographic challenges, to be a voice for a generation that is committed to being here, the one that we need to bring back, and the new generation that we need to draw here, as we work together across generations to recover stronger from COVID-19 and build a really resilient and bright future for our state, which I'm hopeful about.
I want to thank you again, Molly, for making the time to be with us and share your views. And good luck out there on the campaign trail, and virtual or otherwise. And thanks again. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to getting back down to Bennington as soon as I can, and hopefully in person next time.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'd be in the real studio rather than the virtual one.
And I'll leave you with this. Ballots are going out here in Vermont in the next week or so. And that's what I understand from our Secretary of State. 450,000 plus Vermonters will receive a ballot in the mail. That's incredibly exciting. This is vote by mail. Vermonters can lead. So vote early, look for your ballot, turn it in, get your neighbors to vote, your friends to vote, your communities to vote. And you can learn more about resources around voting, same-day registration, where to go to register on my website, mollyforvermont.com. But thank you again for the opportunity. And I hope this general election is as historic as our primary. We had record voter turnout, because in the end, we need every Vermonter, every community at the table as we recover and build a bright future. So thank you again. And I look forward to coming back on the show in the future and getting down to Bennington.
All right. Thank you very much.